2020 was a strange year for humanity in general. The sudden emergence of COVID-19 resulted in many countries around the world going into lockdown, forcing many people to quarantine themselves in their own homes. The holiday season this year was especially rough, as many were unable to meet up with friends and family out of fear that they may contract the virus. Contrary to popular belief, this virus is no laughing matter. More than 80 million cases have already been confirmed, and almost 2 million have passed away. And that number is continuing to grow. Our lives, for the most part, have been put on hold for now. It was a year that was marred by tragedy, a year that brought a shared feeling of trauma to pretty much everyone, and that's not even getting into the numerous police brutality incidents that catapulted the Black Lives Matter movement into the mainstream this year. But if there was one industry that seemingly refused to buckle under the weight of the global pandemic, an industry that continued to thrive despite the terrifying reality that was thrust upon us without any warning, it was video games. Video games provided an escape from real life when we desperately needed it, and thankfully, we had a fantastic assortment of games released in 2020 to sink our teeth and our newfound free time into. In this video, I'll be discussing 5 of my personal favorite games from 2020, and the term personal favorites is something that I really want to emphasize here. It's very likely that you will not find the most critically acclaimed games of 2020 in this video. Most of you probably won't even recognize some of the games on this list. But these games all got me through some incredibly tough times this year, or at the very least distracted me for long enough that I forgot about what was happening just outside my bedroom window, even for a moment. I also want to stress that this video will only be covering games released in 2020 that I've actually played on this channel. Sorry, Hades. Games that became wildly popular long after their initial release are also not eligible to appear on this list. Sorry, Among Us. Brand new ports of older games don't count either. Sorry, Assemble with Care, Hold Down, The Unfinished Swan, and a bunch of others that I can't name off the top of my head right now. Finally, these games are not arranged in any particular order. It's up to you to figure out which one is my most favorite. Alright, without further ado, let's begin. When you stop to think about it, 2020 was also a very strange year for gaming, especially PC gaming. We saw a lot of unexpected success stories from indie developers this year, from the likes of Among Us, Teardown, Phasmophobia, and Fall Guys. Let's talk about the latter game for a bit. Fall Guys is a 60-player battle royale game developed by Mediatonic and published by Devolver Digital. Normally, that would be nothing to write home about. The market has become oversaturated with battle royales at this point. However, Fall Guys is not like other battle royale games, mainly because it's not really a battle royale game. Multiplayer party game is a more appropriate term in my opinion. Fall Guys draws a lot of inspiration from the cult classic game show Takeshi's Castle. As such, the game is structured in a very similar manner. Each game consists of multiple rounds, usually 4 or 5, that are typically chosen in a pseudo-randomized fashion. Each round will have players competing in a minigame, and each minigame has its own rule set. Some are as simple as racing to the end of an obstacle course, with checkpoints scattered throughout the course that players will respawn at if they fall off the map. Others are survival rounds, which contain pink slime at the bottom of the map. Falling into the slime results in an instant elimination. And some of the minigames are team-based, with the losing team being culled at the end of the match. Although many of the minigames behave differently from each other, all of them impose a limit on how many players can qualify for the next round. The playing field will be trimmed out gradually until only the most skilled, or luckiest, contestants remain. Are you a bad enough dude to grab the crown at the top of Fall Mountain? I mean, I haven't managed to do that yet, so I guess that means I'm just bad. Oh well, you can still obtain pity crowns for leveling up, so it's all good in the end. But the defining feature of Fall Guys isn't really its gameplay, it's the art style. Of course, the bright pastel-like colors give the game a welcoming, wholesome vibe that the Battle Royale genre has historically lacked, but the playable characters, a race of weird, anthropomorphic, bean-shaped creatures, are equally charming. Your bean hero is highly customizable too. You can buy outfits for them from the in-game shop, either with your crowns or another currency called kudos, which you can receive for simply completing matches. Fall Guys has had numerous crossover promotions with many different video game franchises. You can dress up your little bean as Sonic the Hedgehog, the Doom guy from Doom, Gris from Gris, and even the Goose from Untitled Goose Game. Fall Guys became a viral phenomenon right out of the gate, thanks in no small part to the way that Mediatonic marketed the game. Giving beta access to the biggest streamers on Twitch was a clever move, no doubt. It also helped that the game's Twitter account caters specifically to streamers and the people who watch them. Seriously though, Oliver age 24 is a marketing genius. Go give him a follow on Twitter if you haven't already. Although many people, myself included, have since moved on from Fall Guys, the game is still going strong even after almost 5 months. Season 3 kicked off recently, which introduced some brand new winter-themed levels and outfits. If anything, Fall Guys is a testament to how powerful Twitch and YouTube have become as platforms. Even the weirdest, jankiest games, which Fall Guys definitely was, at least at launch, can still find a massive audience as long as the upper echelon of streamers and content creators are willing to support it. PC gaming has become wildly unpredictable in recent times, and it's wonderful. I don't know about you, but I would like to see more bizarre success stories like this, please. Moving on from a game that almost everyone and their mom have heard about and probably played, to a game that almost no one has heard about and definitely haven't played. The remaining entries on this list are pretty much all like that, honestly, but again, this is my list of personal favorites, so please don't be offended if your favorite games don't show up here. If you would like to discuss your favorite games of 2020, post them in the comments. Anyway, the next game I want to talk about here is called Lit Bend the Light. This game is one of the most interesting puzzle games I've come across in recent months. The premise is fairly straightforward. You control a wheel with a light beam attached to it, you can move the wheel along a track, and only the track as it cannot move onto any other surface. There's a portal located somewhere in the level, and you need to redirect your light beam into it, which will open the portal and allow you to proceed. The game starts off almost laughably simple at first. Just roll your light beam wheel towards the portal and shoot the beam directly upwards into it. Easy stuff. But in the second level, you're introduced to the concept of reflective surfaces, and this is where things start to get interesting. This time, the portal is directly below you, but it's separated by a wooden platform that blocks your beam of light. As you look around the level, you'll notice that some platforms look like they're made out of steel rather than wood. You shoot your beam of light into one of those steel-like platforms, and you discover that the beam ricochets off of it. And it just so happens that the surfaces leading towards the portal are lined with these reflective plates too. So armed with that knowledge, you position yourself so that the beam bounces off a steel platform, through an opening on the left side of the level, into the crawl space lined with more steel plates, and right into the portal. But as the level complete screen appears, you notice that there was apparently another solution you could have found. So you try again, and this time you inspect the level a lot more closely to see if there were any other surfaces you could have bounced your beam off of. You notice that there's a plate on the wall and the ceiling, so you try and reflect the beam off of those surfaces, and sure enough, the beam bounces off the wall, into the ceiling plate, then off another plate on the right side, into the wall again, and travels through the crawl space and into the portal. You found the second solution. What makes this game so great is its open-endedness. Although the game itself is relatively short, boasting only 36 levels in total, many of the levels have multiple solutions. Now, to be fair, it's nowhere near as open-ended as, say, a Zachtronics puzzle game where nearly every level requires you to solve an actual problem rather than a puzzle. Some of Lit's puzzles can have as many as 6 possible solutions, but they typically don't get more complex than that. But it's the way in which Lit allows you to experiment with its mechanics that make it far more satisfying to play than your average minimalist puzzle game. It occupies a strange middle ground, seemingly combining elements of puzzle solving and problem solving. The game eventually introduces you to mirrors that you can manually raise and lower, and even rotate in any direction you prefer. Refraction lenses become more common in the later levels too, allowing you to bend light in different directions as opposed to simply reflecting it off a surface. On top of that, the game looks and feels like a product of a bygone era, and in this instance, that's not necessarily a bad thing. When I first covered this game on the channel, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lit looked and played like the kind of indie game that would have been released on Steam or maybe even Xbox Live Arcade 10 years ago. Many indie titles from that time were arguably much smaller in scope, and generally consisted of a simple idea that would be iterated upon multiple times in order to keep things fresh and interesting. But believe it or not, Lit was released earlier this year. It's essentially a 2020 indie game that feels like a 2010 indie game. And you know what? I'm totally okay with that. This is almost exactly what I look for whenever I'm browsing Steam for indie titles to cover. Games that present a basic idea that is gradually built upon throughout the course of gameplay. Nowadays, it seems like many indie games are either trying to rival the ambitions of the AAA games industry, or they're nothing more than lazily built shovelware garbage. Lit feels like a throwback to a simpler time when most independently produced video games were based on a good idea with great execution. And I'm here for it. Speaking of unexpectedly fantastic puzzle games, Mixolumia is another one that caught me by surprise. It's a music-driven match 3 puzzler that plays quite a bit like Tetris. Diamond-shaped blocks fall from the top of the grid, which then separate into 4 tiny pieces once they hit the bottom or come into contact with other pieces on the grid. Each piece is colored differently, with 4 possible color variants. The primary objective is to match 3 of the same colored pieces, which will destroy them and generate a music note, the sound of which changes depending on the song that's being played. While that doesn't sound like a unique concept at face value, there is a bit of a catch. The bottom of the grid isn't flat. Much like the blocks themselves, the grid is also diamond-shaped, meaning that the bottom is slanted. This ensures that the blocks will always fall diagonally when they split apart, which adds an additional layer of strategy that Tetris doesn't really have. Also, unlike Tetris, the pieces themselves are affected by gravity, which means they will slide towards the bottom center of the grid, unless there are other pieces blocking their path, in which case they may gravitate towards the left or right side of the grid instead. As you may have been able to guess by now, you don't want the grid to be filled up completely, as that will result in a game over. In the game's default mode, Marathon, the ultimate goal is to match 450 blocks in total, with the game speed slowly ramping up as more blocks are destroyed. But Mixolumia does contain a few alternative game modes, each with their own objective. Rush mode is a score attack mode with a 2-minute time limit. Intense mode is similar to Marathon mode, except you start the game at the fastest possible speed. Endless mode is also a score attack mode, but without a time limit. And Relax mode is essentially a practice mode, where the speed of the blocks never increase and with no possible way to fail. Filling the grid to the top will cause all pieces to disappear without any penalty. It's kind of similar to the Zen mode from the Bejeweled games. When selecting a game mode, you will also be given the option to choose a song. The music in Mixolumia plays a much bigger role than you may think. As I mentioned before, each block that is matched successfully will create a tone, and each song has its own unique set of generative tones. This doesn't really affect the gameplay itself, but it'll surely make you feel like you're actively creating the in-game music as you're playing. That's the power of dynamic soundtracks. It also helps that the music is genuinely great. Mixolumia's soundtrack was a collaboration between Josie Brechner and the game's lead designer Dave Makes. I'm especially a fan of the track Rush by Josie Brechner, a song that starts off slow and steady, but gradually intensifies as it progresses, with the tempo increasing and more instruments being introduced over time. Exclusive to Rush mode, it perfectly encapsulates the escalating pressure as the timer draws closer and closer to that dreaded 2-minute mark. The music in Mixolumia really is amazing. Like, just listen to this song for a minute, okay? Just take a listen to it. The Mixolumia soundtrack is fantastic. Now, that being said, if the music in Mixolumia is not up to your tastes, you can also create your own music for the game. But it's a bit complicated to explain, and I recommend that you read the official documentation for Mixolumia's dynamic soundtrack if you want to learn how to add your own music into the game. There should be a link to the documentation on the game's itch.io page. And just to make it easier, I'll probably link it in the description of this video as well. Not a fan of the game's default palette colors? No problem. There are many other color palettes to choose from in Mixolumia, many of which were submitted by other game developers, and some which are even based on other indie games. Mixolumia is one of the best indie puzzlers to come out in recent years. It feels like a fusion of Tetris and Lumines. Hectic block-dropping action combined with trance-inducing visuals and melodic electronic music. Tetsuya Mizuguchi would be proud. Next, I want to discuss Sagrada. Sagrada was originally released as a tabletop game a few years ago, but that's not the version we're going to be looking at in this video. We'll be focusing on the digital adaptation instead, which only came out this year, so I would say it still counts. Sagrada, the Spanish word for sacred, is a dice drafting game that tasks you with building a stained glass window for a cathedral. Each game of Sagrada lasts for 10 rounds, and dice are drafted at the start of each round. Each player gets 2 turns to select the die to use in their window, with the order of turns reversing at the midpoint of the round. For instance, if you have only 2 players, then once each player takes a turn, the second player gets to go again, followed by the first player. Rounds will end once every player has performed 2 actions in total, and the player who has the final turn in the current round will be given 2 back-to-back turns in the next round. The turn order also changes at the start of a new round, with the second player going first, and so on. The number of dice drafted depends on the player count, 5 dice for 2 players, 7 for 3 players, and 9 for 4 players, and the length of each round also depends on how many players are participating, 4 turns for 2 players, 6 for 3 players, and 8 for 4 players. There will always be at least 1 die that goes unused by the end of the round, which will be added to the round track. Sometimes multiple dice can be added to the track at the end of a round if there are no possible moves remaining for any player, or if a player chooses to skip their turn. But how exactly do you win a game of Sagrada? Well, the windows are comprised of square tiles on a 5x4 grid, 5 columns and 4 rows for a total of 20 tiles. There are 3 different kinds of tiles. Some will have dice numbers on them, others are colored in, and some are completely blank. Colored tiles can only be filled with a die that matches the color of said tile. For example, only red dice can be inserted into red tiles. Numbered tiles can only be occupied by a die that matches the number on the tile, although any colored dice can be used for this purpose. Tiles with 6 dots need to be filled by a die with 6 dots, for instance. And finally, blank tiles have no special requirement. Any die can be placed into one. Also, there are 5 different color variants for the dice themselves. They come in red, blue, yellow, green, and purple. There are many different grid patterns to choose from, some of which are more intricate than others. If you've never played the tabletop edition, it's probably wise to stick with the easier patterns for a while and work your way up from there. It's not as simple as putting down dice into the tiles you want, however. Dice of the same color or number cannot be placed adjacent to each other, but connecting them diagonally is allowed. This adds a layer of strategy to the game, as colored and numbered tiles can sometimes appear next to each other. Placing a 4-dotted purple die in a purple tile might seem like a smart move at first, until you realize that there's a 4-dotted number tile right next to it. If you confirm your move now, you won't be able to fill the other space with another 4-dotted die, since you can't place dice of the same number next to each other. It's important to fill as many spaces as possible, and I'm going to explain why in just a bit. If you find yourself in a predicament, the game provides you with various tools that allow you to modify your dice, but these tools come at a cost. When a new match commences, the game chooses 3 tools at random, which are shared between every player, much like the dice themselves. At the start, it only costs 1 favor token to use any tool at your disposal, but the cost of that tool increases to 2 favor tokens once it's been used by any player. Each tool has its own unique ability. The Grozing Pliers can change the value of a die, the Flux Remover can swap out an undesirable die with a new one, and the Tap Wheel allows you to move up to 2 dice of the same color that have already been placed on the grid, assuming they match a die color within the round track. Of course, there are many more tools available than the ones I've listed, but going over all of them would take far too long, so let's direct our attention to favor tokens instead. What is a favor token, you may ask? Well, it's essentially a currency that you can spend on your tools. It's also an indicator for the difficulty level of each individual board. Some boards only provide you with 3 favor tokens, those are generally the easiest to complete, while the most complex boards can supply you with up to 6 favor tokens. Ideally, you want to use favor tokens as little as possible, since they will award you bonus points at the end of the game. Speaking of which, how do you score points in Sagrada? At the start of each match, you will be handed a private objective. These are objectives that only you can see, and every player has their own unique private objective. They're usually quite simple objectives. Many of them will ask you to place as many dice of a certain color onto the board, and the value of all those dice combined will be added to your score once the match ends. Then there are public objectives, which are shared with every player. To earn additional points, you'll want to complete your public objectives, which can range from creating rows and columns of dice with no repeated colors or values, or being as diverse as possible with your color choice. A number is displayed on the public objectives, indicating how many points you'll receive for completing them, and the so-called color variety objectives are typically the most valuable. The game chooses 3 public objectives to fulfill, and as with almost everything else in Sagrada, private and public objectives are randomized. Remember when I said that filling every empty space on the board is vital to success in this game? The reason why that's so important is because failing to do so results in a point penalty. For every tile that is left blank, a point is deducted from your total score. So, in conclusion, you want to complete your private and public objectives, use your tools only when you're genuinely stuck, and try your absolute best to fill the entire board, leaving no space behind. And of course, try to do all of that better than your opponents. That's how you win at Sagrada. I'm just gonna come out and say it. I love this game. Normally I don't care all that much for tabletop games. I guess I just prefer my gaming experiences to be digital. But the advent of digital adaptations have made many of these physical games a lot more accessible to someone like me, and it helps that they're just as good as the real deal. Direwolf clearly know what they're doing. They were also the developers of the digital version of Root, another critically acclaimed board game. Supposedly, the digital port is also pretty great, and who knows, maybe you'll even see a video of that game going up on the channel sometime in 2021. I think the reason I love Sagrada so much is because it feels like a deeply complex but accessible logic puzzler, which is right up my alley. I'm a huge fan of logic puzzles, and just puzzle games in general. Look at any of the videos I've put out in the past 4 years, and you're sure to find quite a few of them that I've showcased here on the channel. Even better, it's a competitive logic puzzler, with full online multiplayer support, although you do need to create a third-party account to access the game's online features, which is a bit naff. It's very much a game about planning ahead. Any move you try to make will probably seem like a wise decision at the time, but you can easily screw yourself over by placing the wrong die in the wrong place. Any move that you were planning on making in the future can quickly become impossible if you're not careful. Yes, the game does contain plenty of RNG elements, but that's part of the challenge. It forces you to approach each match differently so that you're not relying on the same playstyle every single time. I haven't seen a multiplayer puzzle game with such a deep layer of strategy until I discovered Sagrada. If you're at all a fan of puzzlers, you owe it to yourself to check this game out, even if you've never played the tabletop edition. Although, I would recommend it to anyone who has played the physical version as well. Mixolumia comes very close, but Sagrada is by far the best puzzle game of 2020. I can't help but feel like I'm cheating a bit with this final entry, since it's technically a compilation of games that came out many years prior, some dating as far back as 2008, but hear me out for a minute. The Henry Stickmin Collection is a series of stick figure-style choose-your-own-adventure flash games, originally created by Puffballs United. It consists of 6 games in total, one of which was made specifically for the collection. The first 5 entries were initially released as free standalone games on Newgrounds and Stickpage, with the collection being the first, and possibly the last, commercial release in the series. It's effectively a remaster of the original Henry Stickmin saga. The only real difference is that the original backgrounds have been redrawn at a much higher quality, and many of the sound effects have been changed. The first game, Breaking the Bank, was remade entirely. The collection was developed by Innersloth, an indie studio that Puffballs co-founded. You may know Innersloth best for the work they did on the massively popular social deduction game, Among Us. The game focuses on the antics of the titular Henry Stickmin, a habitual mischief maker who always seems eager to cause trouble anywhere he goes. The game functions in a similar manner as a point-and-click game. You don't control Henry directly. Rather, you are guiding Henry along by selecting choices for him, the majority of which lead to his demise. During your adventure, you will have to help Henry break into a bank, escape a prison, steal a diamond, infiltrate an airship, and escape a much higher security prison, all while chasing after the members of a notorious crime organization known as the Toppat Clan. The game is mostly comedy-focused and doesn't take itself seriously in any capacity. It's chock full of subtle, and not so subtle nods to other video games and entertainment properties. Part of the game's challenge is trying to understand every single reference that is thrown at you. Many of the game's so-called fails are genuinely hilarious, and I don't think anyone will deny that Innersloth has a sense of humor. And that's probably the greatest aspect of the Henry Stickmin games. They're meant to be played incorrectly. Obviously, choosing all of the fails on purpose doesn't get you closer to beating the game, but that's not the point. The fact that the game actively awards you for making the wrong decisions is what makes it stand out from other adventure games of its kind. In fact, you have to view every single fail in order to unlock every achievement. It's actually required for 100%ing the game. How many fails are there in total? Well, with every game combined, about 347. That's a lot of ways to make a stick figure's life miserable. Any choose-your-own-adventure game worth its salt has to have multiple endings, and most of the Henry games have got you covered on that front. The final game in the compilation, Completing the Mission, has 16 possible endings, and the best part is that they're all canon, according to Puffballs at least. So in other words, there is no true ending to Henry's journey, because every ending is technically the true ending, as far as Innersloth are concerned. You're the one who ultimately decides how the story unfolds and concludes, and all of Henry's possible fates are in fact canon, regardless of what you may personally think. That's just how things operate in the Henry Stickmin universe. The branching narrative in Completing the Mission is meant to be a continuation of the previous two Henry games, infiltrating the airship and fleeing the complex, and they're all tied together in a way that feels natural and coherent. It's one thing to add several endings to a game, but getting all of them to make sense in the context of the game's predecessors must have been a challenge for the team at Innersloth. Despite its art style being pretty cartoonish and rudimentary, and relatively similar to Among Us as a result, the Henry Stickmin collection is quite ambitious for a choose-your-own-adventure game. It has several endings across 6 different games, literally hundreds of ways to fail, in-game bios for every character you come across, I didn't even mention that part yet, those also number well into the hundreds, references up the wazoo, and a great sense of humor. As someone who has been a fan of the Henry Stickmin series since Stealing the Diamond, which came out almost 10 years ago now, holy crap, this was a fantastic way to conclude a long-running Flash game franchise. And it seems to have been pretty successful on Steam so far. At the time of this recording, the Henry Stickmin collection has approximately 17,000 reviews on Steam, with an overall user score of 99%. Frankly, I'm glad that this series is starting to find a much bigger audience outside of Newgrounds. I'm not sure if I would say it's more fun to play than Innersloth's other runaway success story, Among Us, but it's a damn fine game in its own right, and anyone who grew up playing the Henry Stickmin Flash games will feel right at home with this collection. If only AAA games were willing to be this risky. If only. And that's about everything I wanted to discuss in this video. Those are 5 of my favorite games released in 2020. As you can clearly tell, this list is comprised mostly of titles that you probably haven't heard of or played. But the purpose of this video was not to discuss the hottest AAA or indie releases of the year. Yes, there were many other incredible games that got us through the unbearable horror show that was 2020, but the point of this video was to showcase my personal favorites that helped me get through one of the most cursed years on record for planet Earth. I did specify in a previous video that I was also going to add some honorable mentions here at the end, but I've chosen to scrap that part of the video. I wanted to keep this list confined to just 5 games, so that way the video didn't become bloated. Believe me, there were many other games I covered this year that I wanted to add to the list, but whenever you're producing videos like this, sometimes you gotta make compromises. Also, there's literally no reason for a video of this type to last more than 30 minutes, so screw it, we're gonna call it right here. This was my first time ever making a video like this, so it may have been a bit shaky at times. I'm used to doing Let's Play videos, but not video essays. I'm not sure if I'll ever produce another video like this again though. I just wanted to try out a different style of content for a change, but I think I'm fine sticking to LPs for now. Thank you guys for watching as always. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like so that the YouTube algorithm starts paying attention to me for once. I'll see you all back here in early January when we will begin our next dive into the bargain bin section of Steam in search of more hidden gems and racing games. I really want to cover more racing games on the channel in the coming months. Hell, maybe we'll even kick off 2021 with a racing game, who knows. But until then, have a safe and socially distanced Happy New Year, everyone. Later!